Welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This lecture covers material in 1 Samuel chapters 17 through 31. Really, it is a finishing up of the book of 1 Samuel, but it is really the first of two lectures that focus on King David. And as mentioned in an earlier lecture, this is really the material that concerns the rise of King David. And the second lecture will consider more of his reign and his succession. As a way of preparing you for what lies ahead, just a few notes about the structure of this lecture. I'm going to start with some reminders about what I said earlier about 1st and 2nd Samuel in an earlier Before You Read lecture. Just a few of the more important points. Then we will focus in on David as he appears in this section of 1 Samuel and some of the complexities of that story. But then I want to talk more broadly about the persona or the memory or even the image of David as we see in the biblical tradition. And then I'll conclude the lecture as I normally do with some strategies for reading. So to begin with, some reminders from the earlier lecture on 1st and 2nd Samuel. Remember that 1st and 2nd Samuel in Hebrew are one document, which suggests that we try to see the two books in our Old Testament that are based on the Greek translation as one sort of story, one narrative. It's important for us to try to keep them together in that way. The second thing that I want to reiterate is the placement of 1st and 2nd Samuel within that literature or that material known as the Deuteronomistic history, and in particular the way that it has a particular theological perspective, and that 1st and 2nd Samuel therefore provide for us a theological reflection on the events of history, rather than an objective or an unbiased historical story. The third reminder is that 1st and 2nd Samuel really are literary masterpieces. This is especially true because of the characterization that we find in them and the complexity of the events that are described. And finally, remember that 1st and 2nd Samuel, I said, really focus on David. There are other characters like Eli and Samuel and even Saul, but really the pervasive focus is on David. And it's important for us now, right? Because we're going to really encounter David for the first time in this second half of 1st Samuel. So what do we know about David from 1st Samuel? In the New Interpreter's one-volume commentary, the author suggests 3 seasons or 3 moments in the life of David according to 1st Samuel. The first is the briefest. It's the period in which David begins to attract the attention of Saul. And this is in chapters 16 and 17. And then for the next portion of David's life, we see David in the court of the king Saul in chapters 18 through 20. And then the longest season in 1 Samuel is that depicting David as a fugitive, fleeing from Saul and Saul's emissaries in chapters 21 through 31. Now, in the beginning, in the first 3 or 4 chapters of this section of 1 Samuel, there are some literary seams or some difficulties in the text. And just one to pay attention to is in chapter 16 and chapter 17. In chapter 16, the text presents David as a court musician who is known to King Saul. Saul is aware of David. But then in chapter 17, all of a sudden we're back out with David in the wilderness as a shepherd, and he is apparently unknown to Saul. And as Jerry Sumney points out in his textbook on the Bible, this makes it difficult to sort of make historical sense out of it. But from a literary and a theological perspective, it's pretty clear that the author is trying to present David as the ideal king, one who is both powerful and compassionate, one who is, able to slay a giant, Goliath, but is also, musically inclined and able to rise to the prominence in the court of another king. And so, again, the theological perspective is really important. as you're reading this material, again, I emphasize the fact that the largest portion is about David fleeing from Saul. And so as you read this, you're going to see that Saul is frequently trying to kill David. He is bloodthirsty for David. And yet, David refuses to kill Saul, even though he's given the chance at least 2 times. If David and Saul have an adverse relationship, David has a complex relationship with other members of Saul's family. David marries, his very first wife that he marries is Michal, who is the daughter of Saul. Saul even hopes that she will be a snare to David, according to 1 Samuel 18:21. So, and this is the first of many wives that David will have, but is, Saul's daughter. And so there's some complexity there. There's also this really intricate and interesting relationship between David and Jonathan. Jonathan is the son of Saul. And Jonathan and David have what I would describe as a covenantal relationship throughout the narrative of 1 Samuel. And Jonathan's loyalty to David is so deep, so much so that he risks alienating himself from his family or from his father. So that's the David that we get. We get this rise to power. We get David and his relationship to Saul and Saul's family members. That's all that we see in 1 Samuel. If we take a step back and consider the larger, what I would call persona of David, as we find in the Bible and in subsequent literature, what do we learn? Well, the really important thing is to note at the beginning is that David has a mixed legacy. There are aspects of the historical or theological memory of David that are positive. We get the impression of David as sort of a good-looking man who's got a great musical ability and physical strength and is deeply brave. We also learn that he positively brings Judah and Israel under a united monarchy. He's a lyre player, a shield bearer, and a consoler in Saul's court, important roles. And yet there are more negative examples or stories about him as well. He sows division in his family and in the families of others. And of course, many of you will remember the story about David and Bathsheba, a woman he commits adultery with and then marries or then makes plans to kill her husband when it is discovered that she's pregnant. His legacy is not a perfect one. There's adultery and rape and incest and murder in his own family. And so it's a complicated legacy as we find in Scripture. Now, if we move outside of 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, we only hear a few mentions of King David. From Psalm 18 and Psalm 34, we get this picture of David as a exceptionally flawed leader who is living a life of intrigue and controversy. Certainly not the sort of ironic personality of 1 Samuel. But then in 1 Chronicles, we get a portrait of David that is almost, the opposite of those Psalms. David is a perfect hero. He's a glorious political and religious leader during Israel's golden age. One of the things to note about David's persona that we've already talked about is his surprising ancestry. So we learn of his ancestry in Ruth 4 and 1 Chronicles 2, and then in the New Testament in Matthew 1 and in Luke 3. And so we get these tensions that on the one hand, he is descended from Judah, and really David fulfills the royal promise that God made to Judah in Genesis 49. But also David comes from a partially non-Israelite descent. He's related to a Moabite, Ruth, and he's related to a Canaanite through Tamar. And so it's telling that Israel's greatest king is not purely Israelite. And so one of the theological consequences of this reality is that David, this great king, shows that God is not bound by nationalism or ethnocentric expectations, a reminder that will be important as we engage other parts of the Old Testament that write about this same period. Now, we know from this literature that David had a huge family. There are at least 8 wives that are named, and probably dozens of other unnamed wives and concubines. In addition, we have 19 named sons and 1 named daughter. But again, the likelihood that there are other many unnamed children is very likely. So, what are the sources for studying King David, for understanding King David? Of course, biblically, we can look at 1st and 2nd Samuel, the beginning of 1st Kings, and 1st Chronicles. There are other sources that the Bible mentions, books or collections that the Bible mentions that we no longer have in our possession, which suggests that at some point in history there was more written about David that we no longer have. Scholars have suggested that there are perhaps 2 documents that have been used or maybe lie behind our books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And the first is often described as the history of David's rise, and it's roughly from 1 Samuel 16 through 2 Samuel 5, most of what we're reading for this lecture. And this is the rise to prominence and perhaps a literature that has this apologetic function to say that David's rise to power was justified. It was ordained even by God. The second narrative, the second major document that might have been used is known as the succession narrative, and it's from 2 Samuel 9 through 20, and then from the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings. And this depicts the end of his life. And what's interesting about this second narrative is that Old Testament scholars often regard this as the closest that we get to what we would maybe call objective history writing among all of the Old Testament writings. And so, again, the possibility that these are the earlier or independent sources, many scholars have suggested that. But what I think many scholars would also point out is that the way that we encounter 1st and 2nd Samuel in its final form is not so broken up. If there was a later editor or writer, they've done a good job of making it a single narrative. Now, outside of the Bible, there is very little evidence or discussion of King David. There are no non-biblical writings that mention David. He's not mentioned in the historical annals of other cultures, in other words. There is one interesting piece of archaeological data, which is known as the Tel Dan Stele. And this is a largest piece of rock written, I believe, in Aramaic, and it's likely that this stele refers to the king of Israel, and it may even mention the house of David. But this would be one of the sort of sole or solitary references to the kingdom of David that we have outside of the Bible. Other archaeological evidence that we have concerns what was life like during the start of the Iron Age, Iron Age 2, which was from around 1000 to 586 BCE. This would be around the time that David was taking power, right at the start of Iron Age 2. And in many ways, we know from archaeological discoveries that this was kind of a golden age for Israelite life. It was characterized by building activities and political expansion. And so this might help us sort of correlate what the Bible says about David and what might have actually happened. It's worth noting in a lecture like this that there are some scholars who doubt the historical evidence of David altogether, especially because of the lack of outside sources. Many scholars who would identify themselves as critical scholars would still say that there was a historical figure of David, but certainly that what we find in the Bible is a theologically interested retelling of that story and of his role in the history of Israel. Finally, what are some strategies for you as you read this material? Again, as I said in the first lecture on 1 Samuel, I invite you to pay attention to the complexity of characters, particularly David and Saul and Jonathan. Right along with that, pay attention to the relationships in the story. What do you learn about the characters through their relationships to each other? The relationship between David and Saul, or between David and Jonathan, or even between Jonathan and Saul. Finally, I invite you to pay attention to the role of God in the narrative. What do you notice about God's hand or God's direction in the narrative? Is it a prominent role? Is it sort of secondary? Is there anything surprising about it? What is God up to in this part of the narrative? Well, again, I invite you to dig in now to this material from 1 Samuel. I hope that your reading will be productive. Can't wait to hear what you see. Now, happy reading.